So these origin stories, the contradictions are not major or anything, but different authors told different stories. The origin of names, so there's different versions on how Ishmael, Israel get their name. The story of Hagar is told differently. How many years the Israelites spent in Egypt is a variety. The Red Sea, so let me go into this one. So the Red Sea was a story that was told differently, the crossing of the Red Sea. So we say Red Sea, but the Hebrew really means sea of reeds. But anyhow, if one carefully reads Exodus 14, paying attention to Hebrew vocabulary, stylistics, and the theme of the way Exodus 14 is shown, is discussed, one notices that there's actually two different crossing of the Red Sea story being told here that were sort of stitched together. One story, I don't have the exact verses here, but this is all on my website actually. But one story tells a story about how Yahweh, all night long, blew back the waters. And in the morning, the Israelites hid on the shore, and the Egyptians crossed over the seabed, and then Yahweh let the waters come over them, and they were washed up on the seashore. That's how that story is told. And if you take the verses that scholars have identified, written by this author because of stylistic, linguistic, thematic similarities, if you take those verses out, you have a story that makes sense. There's no gaps in it. Yahweh all night long blew back the wind. The Israelites did not cross. They stood on the side. The Egyptians crossed over, and then they were washed up on the shore. We're more familiar with the way an older storyteller told the story. Moses had a rod, and he waved it across the Red Sea, and it parted. The Israelites went through, and the Egyptians followed, and the Egyptians didn't get washed up on the sea here, but they ended up being drowned. So these are two different ways stories were told, and scholars might speculate. The later... Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask you a question before we move on from that? Who would be the one that stitches these stories together
right
into one?
Right. So this would be a later particular editor. And again, here, Kyle, the question is more speculative for authors. For example, 100% confident there are contradictions in the Bible. The text tells me that. I have an object. But then if you were to ask, well, why did a later editor stitch together two contradictory versions of a story? Well, we have to speculate. I don't have the mind of the author here. That's more of a speculative task. One of the things that scholars have thought might have been a scribal activity. The flood story also, the two stories are stitched together as well. So this might have been a scribal activity to try to preserve two traditions without throwing away one or the other. The two creation stories, you can't stitch those together. So the editor said, okay, whole first one, whole second one. They must follow each other. Other scholars have surmised that what we call the Bible and the way we read it today as a narrative perhaps wasn't the way they read it back when they were creating these particular texts. The Bible might just have been an anthology where scribes just preserved various different versions of the story. In other words, their sole objective might have been just to collect different versions of the same story.
Oh, that's interesting. And another thing, before you go on with your list of contradictions, I want to hit back to, you said that there was a version of the flood that had 7 pairs of...
Yeah, or 7 animals. Maybe it wasn't pairs. I have to go back to the text, yeah.
But they want 7 of each?
Yeah, 7 of each. I think that's the way the wording was. And the other one was a pair of each animal, male and female, as it were. And when you look at the different strand, the story of the flood that tells Noah to collect 7, that particular story is an older story that ends after the flood. We rejoice and we give a sacrifice to Yahweh. So some of those animals were saved for a sacrificial right to Yahweh. And the other one, there is no sacrificial right at the end of that story.
They had to fit 7 of each animal onto the boat.
What do you think?
Yeah, I'd have to...
real quickly, what do you think of the relationship between the flood in the Bible and the deluge that was in the Epic of Gilgamesh? Do you think there's a comparison there to be said?
Yeah, but not on a historical level, on a literary level.
So
many of the cultures that were writing these texts they lived on delta areas that often flooded. So imagine you're an ancient culture. You have a flat perspective of the world. It's very limited. You probably think the world is a finite space. And often the delta causes such drastic flooding that you could say the hyperbole, the whole earth is flooded. So these stories, according to an ancient person, there was a natural element that threatened his existence daily. One of that was the uncontrollable force of water, especially if you're living on the delta. The other was death, and the other was fertility. So you have a God that can control all those natural elements. This is Yahweh is presented that way in the Exodus narratives. Marduk is presented that way. The Egyptian god Osiris. I mean, all these gods control these forces that were a constant threat to these ancient civilizations.
You can continue with you. I didn't mean to cut you off in the middle of you were on a roll there with your contradictions. I just wanted to, I was curious about the stitching together thing. I think that's a very interesting point to take note of.
Yeah, and that's something that scholars still debate on. I mean, there's things that we actually know for sure, like different sources cause different contradictory views, and then there's other things that we still debate on. Why was this stitching happening in particular? So that's an interesting question there, yeah.
Okay, did you have any more examples you wanted to run through?
Yeah, so just more examples of the storytelling type. So here, let me go into maybe a little bit. So there's two cities in northern Israel, Penuel and Bethel. And both of these cities sort of tell the story of how God changed Jacob's name to Israel at Penuel. And then later there's another story that says, God changed Jacob's name to Israel at Bethel. So basically these two cities wanted to accredit their foundation with the patriarch Jacob. So the Bible preserves both of those. So the editors who stitched this together, Kyle, felt like he didn't want to throw one of these stories out. So he made a more fuller narrative that sort of preserved both of these stories. There's more. Let me get into some of the more theological contradictions that I like to study more, because they sort of reveal, again, as a scholar, I'm really interested in what were these authors' theologies and religious views and even views of their God Yahweh. So in the book of Genesis 4:26, and then there's a bunch of other chapters in Genesis, we hear a story where Eve evokes Yahweh by name for the first time. And then the text tells us from this time forward, the name Yahweh was invoked. So in other words, the author that told this story is telling us that the earliest generation of humans knew who Yahweh was. And then also later in Genesis 11 and 12, Abraham is presented as establishing different cultic sites throughout northern Israel. And in each site, he invokes the name of Yahweh and sets up an altar to the name of Yahweh. So we know the text tells us that Abraham specifically knew God by his name Yahweh. And there's even a story of him having lunch with Yahweh on one occasion. When we get to a different textual tradition in the book of Exodus, chapter 6, verse 2 and 3, the author that wrote this text, so this is Moses meeting Yahweh for the first time. And the author of this text has his Yahweh in his text tell Moses, nobody before you, Moses, knew who I was by name. They all knew me through a different name, El Shaddai, which now scholars connect the origin of Yahweh back to the Canaanite god El, but that's a whole nother story. But anyhow, the contradiction is one author was free to say that Yahweh was known to the earliest generation of humans and henceforth. And another author was uncomfortable with that idea for whatever reason and pretty much put forward the contradictory idea. Moses was the first one that knew God by his names. So those are different theological differences as well.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, and Kyle, the unfortunate thing is I study this stuff because I find it fascinating. But the thing is, none of this information gets out to the general public, and then when I listen to an atheist and theist talk about contradictions in the Bible, I sit there and have to close my laptop, So to some extent, to elevate the conversation.
The contradictions that I think that you deal with mostly on YouTube in terms of the the contradictions between atheists and theists, they're not even close to a level in detail as these things are. You know, like they don't even touch like the lunch with Yahweh thing. I've never myself.
I'm just picturing a picnic in my head.
Yeah, what would they order?
Well, okay. So I myself, I think it's a dinner. Yahweh and two other men come to visit Abraham. So I myself sort of made it a little parody by using the word lunch. So
I like it. But yeah, you don't deal with contradictions in detail about that. And I wonder at what point, how can you just gloss over that substantial of accounts in one book?
Right. And, you know, Kyle, I mean, it really comes down to the issue. And I wrote about this in the conclusion of my book. And again, I'm very sympathetic towards Christians and where they're coming from. I'm not there to destroy religion, destroy God, or anything like that. I'm here to destroy misbeliefs or misconceptions about a collection of ancient texts. But ultimately, when it really comes down to it, the label, the Holy Bible that we talked about earlier, that implies inerrancy, that implies divine authorship, that implies a homogeneous narrative, all of those implied beliefs in that title are more authoritative to a Christian in understanding this collection than what the texts themselves actually say, than the varied and competing beliefs of our authors. So that's and that's what I mean. As a graduate student, I was interested in interpretive traditions. That's the real power of an interpretive tradition. You have a later interpretive tradition that says this is a book written by God. And what that interpretive tradition says about these texts is now more authoritative in describing the text than the texts themselves. And that's the paradox of this.
Real quickly.
So the title has the power, not the text. Basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Real quickly, because people missed the beginning because of issues. Could you want to again kind of go over your backgrounds on this? We have a theologian that's kind of taken a different approach and wondering what your what your area of specialty is in for your PhD.
Well, I wrote my PhD on Paul's Old Testament interpretation, and pretty much specifically, if this is specifically for a theologian, in the early church, there's a tradition that Paul started a particular type of interpretation of the Old Testament that was Christological is really the wrong word. The specific word is typology. In other words, that Old Testament events prophesies the events of Jesus' life. So this is a very popular form of exegesis where a later Christian community reinterprets an earlier community. My dissertation pretty much said, no, Paul was not doing that. That's how later Christians perceived Paul. But in more general, I was interested in how later New Testament authors reinterpret the Old Testament to suit or even to answer theological questions and historical concerns of their own period.
Can we go into detail? We talked earlier about Genesis 1 and 2. This is something that I think is fascinating. The two, they're literally side by side, different accounts of the creation story, and how you can kind of skip over that and gloss over it, I guess, is kind of funny. But I like to explain the two different stories and why they're so obvious.
Right.
The author put them side by side.
So again, my book lays out 63-page textual argument of the detail. And over here on my other computer, I've sort of noted a couple of talking points. So I'll get into that. Before I do, again, we might come back to this idea. If you have anyone approaching this collection of ancient literature and their starting point for understanding this is all the belief claims implied in the title, the Holy Bible. In other words, their starting point is this is the Word of God. This is inerrant. This is a single, homogeneous, non-contradictory narrative. If that's their starting point, then they already start, Kyle, from somewhere else. They start from an exterior interpretive vantage point, and they're not starting with the text themselves.
They're biased. They're going to be biased.
Right. So that's the initial problem right off the way. So then the reading of the text is going to be a reading that's going to confirm these exterior belief claims that the particular reader has. So to some extent, I have to encourage my Christian readers to realize that all these later belief claims, the text is written by God. It's inerrant. It's a homogeneous single narrative that leads to Christ coming back in the end days, is actually a fabrication, if we will. It's really an interpretive tradition developed by a later reading community who had to answer their own issues in theological